So what does being a great session player mean to you?
To me, it's like being a really, really reliable contractor. There's a lot of dependency on you to get a certain job done, and you don't often know what that is when you show up.
So as far as like getting into sessions, so after that period of time where you're exploring, recording equipment,
Yeah.
you're leading the charge and figuring out a way to get your band stuff recorded. Where did that transition happen to where you thought, well, man, I could make a living doing this, and Nashville is probably a place to start that career?
So there was a guy on local radio. He got to hear a demo tape of something that I did of just, I think it was like some instrumentals, some guitar stuff. And I got to talk to him through some people my mom knew who worked at the local radio station. And that guy that was the first time I ever had like real affirmation of like, he'd worked in radio, he'd been to Nashville. He was sort of in that world, country music, like in 90s and 2000s. And he was like, yeah, you should go, man. You'll have fun. It'll be great. Like, you'll love it. Like, yeah, you would be great. And I was like, okay, well, that's cool. And then I started asking around, and then someone at Valley Arts Guitars, Gibson, connected me with Brent Mason, who at the time was like my hero. Like, that's all I was listening to. Like, he was the first guitar player he was the first guy that I ever discovered as like being like, okay, this is a session player. Like, I was able to make that understand the difference between a guy in a band or like a guy who tours or like a producer, and like, okay, this is someone who is exclusively a session player. Like, I bought his VHS and I had his instrumental record, and I started kind of digging deep and finding out all the stuff that he played on, and it was all these records that were pretty hard to get. I mean, like, you couldn't get like an Alan Jackson record where I grew up in England. I mean, you had to go somewhere, order it specially, find it. Like, so I started kind of digging around and picking up some of those CDs, and someone who worked at Gibson knew that I was a fan of Brent. He's forwarded some of my stuff, like some videos of me just playing like some country solos and some instrumentals. And Brent was the first one that was like, you should come here and you should see what it was like. And he recognized something in me that he said he saw in himself, and he told me to come over, and he was like, man, if you make it to Nashville, if you come over, like I'll let you sit in on some sessions, and like you can just kind of shadow me, and like I'll.
So was that your first step when you got here? You were sitting in on some sessions with him.
First step, yeah. I just get to come along and just hang out in the background and watch how it went down, and that was the magic moment. Was the first time ever hearing a demo come out of the speakers in the control room from someone bringing in a work tape. And they were making a chart. It was Brent and Eddie Bayers and Paul Franklin and those guys, like Biff Watson. I'd heard about how things were recorded and how it was done, but I'd never seen it before. And when that first time happened and I heard them play like a finished song out of the speakers, and they all were playing the fills and the guitar licks and the steel licks and the solos and stuff in the exact spots between the vocals. And when I'd heard these records from the CDs that I'd gotten back home, I had assumed it was this process. It was this production process that was what I was used to, like working with bands, like going over and over again, like fixing mistakes, like, getting the right thing. But then I heard these guys do it all in one take, and it just felt like a finished song.
That's amazing, man. I mean, that story is an incredible example of the power of mentorship.
Yes.
And a real source behind our inspiration to create this whole platform with the Studio Musician Academy is to provide that type of mentorship to people that aren't as fortunate to be able to just kind of have that really helpful, connection be made and, and get there. It's so
important.
So you walked into the studio, you sat in on the session, and you saw finally how the record came together.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that you saw the bar that you had to rise to in order to be able to sit in those chairs. What did you start to do to cut your teeth and get prepared to be able to participate in that type of session?
I think in that moment, I learned probably more just from hearing that song come out of the speakers. I learned more than what I would have learned in 4 years if I'd have done like a musician university course, like back in England or somewhere, like, and studied. Like, I was like, it just clicked and it just made sense. I was like, wow. It's like you said, it was like, this is the standard, like this is the level that I have to get to. So I guess like what I started doing was, well, first I had to go out on the road and gig, because I had to, after that it was like, I decided, I was like, I gotta move here. I gotta make this happen. So I did all the visa stuff, moved, and I was like, okay, bills, how do you pay bills? Okay, you got a gig. You got to, just pick up whatever you can. I ended up going out on the road pretty early on in my career, playing with Jake Owen. I was like 18, 19. That was an amazing experience. I'd never done anything like that before, and that was a pretty important thing to do. Like, I feel like it's kind of cliche, but it's like you got to do that first, like before you can really be a studio player. I mean, there's exceptions, but I think it's just part of it. It's part of the whole. It's character building, and I think it's just important to experience both sides of things, so that you got to do it before it's not what you want to do. I was just trying as best as I could in between doing road gigs and doing stuff in town to try to. I had to figure out how to write and read charts. That was a big thing, because I didn't know that before I moved. I mean, I knew it was a thing, but I didn't really understand how important it was. I was always an ear player, which probably helped to some degree. It's like most of the first gigs that I did, there wasn't charts. It was listening, playing, just going over and over again, the same way that I would have learned something back home in England, like in a cover band or something. It was just, you learn the form, but then that doesn't work in a session situation super well, because they're like, okay, we're going to completely change this part. Let's change these chords on the bridge, or like, let's get rid of this. Then it starts like messing with you. You're like, oh, okay, let me listen to that again. Let's run it, like, which you can't do.
So once you started to recognize that the live touring thing wasn't going to be your long-term thing, did you make a conscious transition into like, I'm not going on the road anymore? Or was it a slower sort of evolution where you started to transition into that? How did you figure out a way to be able to sustain a career without the gigs, the live gigs here and there, and how did you transition into being in the studio full time?
So I tried 3 times, failed twice, and succeeded on the third time. Like the first time I was like, I'm not going to do this anymore. I just want to make records. Got 6 months in, I was like, I'm broke. I don't have any money. I need to. So I went out again, did another like 2.5 years, left after that one, and was like, okay, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to go back to, I want to try to make records again, because there was, it's getting some work, and there was just a few little things where I was like, okay, if I can build on this. And I think the mistake a lot of people can make is putting too much faith in, when people talk about accounts, of being like, okay, like this guy hired me 3 times in the last month. Like that doesn't mean it's going to be 3 times a month, like forever. It's like, it could be completely sporadic. Like anything could change. Like, they might use something else. Like they might decide that they're not even going to make music anymore. It's like you could just completely lose your work, you know what I mean, at any given time, or you just get a little too optimistic. You just think like, okay, like this was, I did this one master session, I'm in now, like I'm this is what I do now. It's like, no, it doesn't work like that. It's and I just don't think I was good enough at either of those 2 points. You know what I mean? I think I was still learning, and I think I was willing to learn, which was what helped me move forward from that point. But there was like definite points where I just look back, I was just like, man, like I don't think I really got it. Like I didn't, just didn't get it, as people say, like in quite the way that, the enthusiasm was there. I had the chops. I could, the execution was probably there too, but there was just like little subtle nuances of things where I just think like, oh yeah, I just wasn't quite there yet. I just didn't quite have the thing, like wasn't quick enough. Maybe I was just a little too excited to be there, like maybe just trying too hard. They say it's like you got to have 10,000 hours doing it to become comfortable with like any craft, and particularly studio stuff. There's really no way to fast track that 10,000 hours, and I think that awkward period between me trying to transition off of the road and trying to get into the studio world, it was like, at the time, I wasn't very happy, and it was just, just constantly living in stress of how am I going to pay bills and just what is going to happen next month. It wasn't until that third try of being like, I'm going to get off the road, where it like finally picked up, and it became something of like, okay, I don't have to take a gig now. It's a very awkward transition period, and I think a lot of guys would say the same thing of just, there is no way to fast track that transition.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So getting into sort of like your creative process when you're going in, what sort of things do you look for in making your parts stand out, but still being able to fit within the scope of a band, as you mentioned?
I always, my approach is I throw everything at the wall and I see what sticks. Like, I'm always right out of the gate. Like, I like to be creative on a first pass. Sometimes it's really great to just play a basic rhythm track coming out of the gate but I always try to make sure it has a purpose and has a feeling of some sort. I always want to kind of make it feel like something, like how it's got to have like an identity.
So it sounded like a lot of what helps you stay creative is by not getting stuck in like doing the same thing over and over again, trying to switch things up, to be able to stay inspired in what you're hearing, which can allow you to maybe be a little more creative with the parts that you're coming up with. How does that apply to the other people in the room around you? What sort of things do you listen for to make sure that you're able to be a part of the whole thing, as opposed to just being focused on your part as a guitar player?
It's definitely locking in with the rhythm section is just sort of, that's an obvious thing, but it's almost like if one side of your brain is handling this, like, okay, I'm playing, everything's got to be in tune, everything's got to be timed right, the licks have got to be good, the way that I'm handling my instrument has got to be the certain way, and then the other side of your brain is there just to listen to what's going on. Mm-hmm. Which I think is easier said than done. I think it's like you can do that, but once you get those two sides communicating, I think that's one of those things that clicks after that, like 10,000 hours.
How do you approach the situation where the producer doesn't necessarily love, the part, but you might be really excited about it?
It's not like being an artist or a songwriter where you're writing poetry and something and someone's saying, I don't like that. I mean, like, that's got to be like soul crushing. Like, that's writers are much stronger people than me, for sure, just for that reason, where it's just like, it's of course it's gonna upset you, and it's gonna be, there's gonna be a little bit of part of you that's just like, well, I liked it. It's cool when you get like a producer who's maybe not like super experienced in that genre. Like if you get someone who's a pop producer, a rock producer crossing over doing a country record, and they haven't done a bunch of them, that's fun, because that could be like an educational thing, and you can they might have some ideas that are really, really awesome, and that stuff that's never been done before. And then there's sometimes things where you got to collectively be, as a band, you'd be like, hey, that's not something you can do on this record. That shouldn't be here.
Are there any unique approaches that you take, or how do you think about approaching that when you're in that position where you feel like this is a time where you should speak up and maybe give the producer your feedback on why something may be worth exploring that they might not see the vision for in the moment?
At the end of the day, it's like, if you're contributing and it's a good, positive contribution, always speak up. You know what I mean? If you got an idea, and I think a good general rule is always have an alternative, like have an avenue that you want to pursue, rather than just saying, oh, this isn't working. Like, you gotta have a better idea before you shoot down one idea. Like, it's like, you can't just say, oh, this isn't working, but I don't know, what should we do? I think if it comes from a good place, if you know in your heart that you're like, this really, really would be better. And I think that's becoming more and more common now in this age of all players are producers in their own right. I've never really seen any situations where that's gone completely wrong. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
It's like so it sounds like coming at a place of caring and approaching it positively without taking your ego out of it. But just,
right.
In support of the larger vision.
Yeah.
And from your approach, you would err on the side of speaking up if you feel strongly about something.
Yeah.
But also the great point I think that you made was making sure that you have an idea to share, or a way of doing it. So that way something isn't totally derailed, but you can like kind of try to move it and help guide it in that direction, And I imagine that it depends a lot on who you're working with. So being aware of the producer, being aware of the artist and the situation, and probably also like what the goal is that day. Like, is it a demo session where you're doing 6 songs? You're probably not going to discuss the tempo as much, but you're working on a track where you have time to work through it with the artist, then that's the right case to do that. So would you say that how much you're speaking up depends on who you're working with in the scenario as well?
Yeah, definitely. 100%. Like it's one of those nuances is kind of reading the room. Mm-hmm. Like just don't share your ideas unless it's something that's really, really quick.
So what sort of things do you do at this stage in your career to practice, to keep your chops up, to keep it going? I find that can be a difference between players, and some people feel like, man, I'm doing this 50 hours a week already. When I'm not in a studio, I'm practicing every day when I'm playing. So other people have a daily practice of doing that. What's your approach for exploring new ideas, for practicing and working on new skills?
Yeah, I don't play much in my free time because I don't really have much. You know what I mean? And I think maybe more than I did a few years ago when I was hitting it really hard, just trying to do all the work that I could. And I was, 80 hours a week, like always working on something. Now I'm thinking, I'm getting a little older. I'm trying to kind of take more time for myself, like because of, you start noticing the effects of stress and stuff start coming in a little bit more when you're not in your 20s. You start noticing like, oh, I'm not like super healthy as a result of all of this. Like maybe I need to not be doing so much work and stuff. And
so it sounds like in some ways, like your way of growing and staying inspired is by getting away from the tool that you use every day for a little bit, so you can come back to it with a fresh energy.
Yeah.
Nice. When did you start to recognize that it was important to do that? How long did that take?
As far as actually getting away from it, and pretty recently, probably just in the last couple of years, having an adult life outside of music and not just winging it, just going from gig to gig or session to session, just eating junk food in between, sleeping 3 hours a night kind of thing. Like I was like, okay, now I can actually I can make plans on the weekend and go to a nice restaurant and like do that thing. It's like this, it's like the joys of it. You know what I mean? I feel like that's the stuff that you all work towards, and you picture that when you're younger. You're like, I want to be able to have like a normal life, like where I can have a career but also function as a human and do normal people things.
Yeah, for me when I was younger, I just thought that like you get into this and you love it so much. I didn't even think about the necessity of doing anything other than music. It was just like you do that 24/7, you barely sleep, you eat horrible,
Yeah.
But then eventually you get to a point where you're like, man, in order to sustain this career for the rest of my life, we do have to find things outside of it, to bring us joy and stuff. So what sort of things for you? You found sports. You found trying to find a little bit of a balance with like your timing and schedule with things.
Yeah. Just I bought a couple old cars to work on. Just not necessarily doing all the work myself, but just having something that's just a project. Like I just always would do the Reverb and eBay scrolling for guitars and gear, amps and pedals and recording gear and stuff. That was like my late night thing. Just like lay in bed, compare prices, buy things, and do that whole thing. I was just like, it's still guitar related. It's not that I'm not taking a break. It's like I need to get away from that. So now it's like, follow some soccer teams and stuff.
And so you do quite a bit of home recording. You have a really cool, incredible setup with all kinds of different gear. From the instrument side to the recording side and all of that. And it's clear that passion that started when you were really young has not ended and, continues to grow. Tell me a little bit about your setup and your workflow from home when you're not going into a studio to do a tracking session.
It's probably not very good in the sense of it works for me. I don't have a kind of setup where someone could just come in, and it's not super streamlined. I have 6 inputs on the Apollo. I don't have a patch bay or anything like that. I did for a while. It just got a little complicated, and I was getting some noise issues and stuff, and it was just a lot of cables running around my place. And so now everything is hardwired. I just have a pre and a compressor on each channel that I don't ever change. I just have an assortment of pre's, some outboard gear. It's just I don't experiment much. It's more the need for me to stay on point and stay focused on the song and serving the song rather than getting too involved in the gear. And I'm just not a trained engineer, you know what I mean? I don't trust myself to make decisions that are super drastic. It's like I gotta just have a clean signal on something and then figure it out later. Like, gotcha. I like messing with plugins and stuff, but the gear side of stuff scares me a lot. Like, I don't want to... If this amp and this guitar and this pedal sound good, I'm not going to mess with it because I don't want to risk making it worse.
So with your inputs, you have separate amps and pedal like signal chain for each kind of type of sound that you have, or how does the sound change dependent upon the song that you're working on?
It changes dependent on... I'm using the Torpedo Live, I think it is, for IRs, for cab sims. I don't know if it sounds worse than real amps. It's pretty close. It's you plug the heads in and have the cab. That's pretty useful because I'm so basic on every piece of gear, anything that I own that has presets or a digital menu of any kind. I make like 3 patches and I stick with them for 10 years. Like, I don't mess with anything. So when I got that piece of gear, I made one patch that's like a 1x12 Celestion. I made another one that was like a 412 greenback Marshall thing. And then I did one patch that was like a 110 Princeton kind of thing. And that was just the day I bought it, made those patches, loaded them in. I haven't touched them since. Like, so I just have those 3 cab settings, which is pretty accurate to how real life recording is. Honestly, it's like even on master sessions, you don't have a lot of liberty to go change out a speaker cab, unless something's really not working and you're like, yeah, this 412 isn't working. We got to do like a little deluxe reverb or something instead. Most of the time, it's like you can get it set up and it's the engineer's job to make it sound good. And if there's something really inherently wrong with it, you switch it out. Otherwise, it's like, that's your cab. And a lot of people say, I mean, like the guitar tone, most of it comes from the speaker cab. The amps and guitars and stuff, like, yeah, they've got characteristics, but as far as something being the right sound, it's whether it's kind of pretty flat on the way the speaker responds and records. The little torpedo box helps a ton with that because there's no room for error, especially with me just being by myself in my place. I got neighbors and stuff, like can't really crank a 100-watt amp. It's like then you're in that whole world of like, okay, I've got to cover it in blankets or use a load box or something, and then it just sort of defeats the whole purpose of doing it in the first place. You may as well just go in the box at that point. So the cab sim thing helps with that. It makes it idiot proof because I consider myself somewhat an idiot when it comes to that stuff, as my knowledge of it is very basic. Can't allow myself to experiment too much because I'll probably mess it up.
What DAW do you record in?
I'm in Pro Tools.
Do you use any in the box amp simulators or plugins?
They all sound good. Honestly, I've never used a bad one. Like some of the UAD stuff the amps are good. I've never done that unless I have to. It always just makes sense for me to just use the real amps because I've got them right there and they're all switchable. Mm-hmm. I could plug.
So you have all your amps set up and they're on switcher. You can switch between the different ones and then use the virtual cabinet to be able to run it in.
I'm about to be in my cartage. I have a Kahayan switcher where I can go between the heads on a little toggle switch, and it's awesome. And I've got a second one that I bought, and it showed up, it was busted and it didn't work, so it's actually at British Audio right now. It's been there for like a month and a half. They're trying to find the parts to fix it, so that will be a future thing. But honestly, at home, I'm probably not going to even be doing much of that. It's like, I'm more like, I'll use an amp for, instead of using for like, oh, here's a part or a track on a song or a solo or something, I'm like, I'll use an amp for like a month, and then I'll switch to another one for like the next month. Like, and it's for my own ears mostly. It's just, if I don't feel like I'm getting what I need out of an amp, and it just doesn't feel right, then I'll switch it. It's like, it's not for the tones. I wish I was better at that. I don't think I really have an ear for that whole thing of like, multi-amp tracking. I think with, especially it being in country world for so long, I think it's just like, you gotta kind of keep it simple, just for the sake of that workflow that you were talking about, like being in the studio. It's like, you gotta,
so when you're asked for a different sound, what are you changing to adjust that?
Just a pedal, usually just different flavors of pedals, or a guitar, you know what I mean? And I think it's sort of the general basic humbucker single coil thing. I've never bought a set of pickups and changed them in a guitar because I wanted it to sound different. You know what I mean? It's like, if I don't like how a guitar sounds, I'll sell it and just buy something else. And some stuff will have a shelf life of, I'll use it for a couple months and I really dig it, and then I put it away and then don't use it ever again, or sell it. It's like, 'cause it all is very subjective. I think it's from trying to understand producers more and how mixing and stuff works, is that everything can sound good and everything can sound bad, and there's all those variables that come into it, and it's usually it's not about the gear. I think it's good to have a couple safety points. It's like, I think it's a feel thing. I think it's just it's interpreting that information that's in the song and that's something that's in the track and pushing it a certain direction. It's like, I think that masculine and feminine energy is very important, and that's sometimes a tone thing, but I think it's mostly in the approach. That's a big variable on the way that I approach guitar, and it's probably with other instruments and stuff as well too. I think just listening to a subject matter of songs and listening to lyrics will help me decide how much gain is going on a pedal or something.
Yeah.
But
that's really interesting to think about that in the way that it would inform the emotion of the sound, and
right,
then using your instinct to be able to shape that sound into matching the energy of the song.
If you're working on a record, you don't necessarily think that it has to be like the same mic or the same signal chain for like one singer. It might be like a rock project where it's got to sound like a live set and it's all got to be like consistent. You use one thing, and then like some stuff you just be like, oh, there's one song that it doesn't want that at all. It's going to be like completely different, or we'll do a ribbon mic thing or something. Like, I'm kind of that way with guitar, as like not so much the miking and the engineering side of it, but with tones and stuff like that. Unless someone said, oh, we want this to sound exactly like the last thing that we did. I also, a lot of the reason I keep it really simple is because of that. It's being able to pull up. I did, do one song for one guy 3 months ago, and they really like what I did on that song, and they want something similar for this new one that they sent me. I don't want there to be too many things that'll prevent me from getting that same tone. It's like, I'll know that it's like, oh, it has to have been at least one of these two pedals. It was probably like this, a little bit of that, or I'll listen to, I'll pull up the Pro Tools session, I'll listen to it for a couple seconds to try to figure out like which speaker cabinet setting it was for that rhythm tone that they liked, and then I can kind of go from there. But just I try not to overthink it too much.
So if you could hop on a time machine now and go back to talk to 12-year-old you, knowing what you know now, what piece of advice would you give yourself for moving forward into your current career that you wish you would have known back then?
I would say just everything, really, but at the same time, it was what we were saying earlier. It's that 15, 20-year journey is what makes it what it is. You know what I mean? I'm really, really happy with where I'm at, and I'm doing all the things that the 12-year-old me would have dreamed of doing. So I think, despite some of the just experiences and stuff, it's like it's along the way. It's all part of it. Like I think anyone would tell a younger version of themselves, like, listen more, like pay more attention to things. It's like, I think I'd be better at what I do if like there was just more of that going on. But I think sometimes the not listening and the mistakes that are caused from that, and the stuff that you retroactively learn as far as lessons, it's like, it's like being in school, you're just like, oh, I didn't pay attention during that class, and now this is the result of that. And
so you pay more attention next time.
Yeah, but sometimes when you're in detention, you meet some of the other kids who people I ended up doing music and stuff with, that kind of, I think they're sort of always that way. And I always try to give that advice to artists and people who like moving to town, and people who want the advice thing. It's sort of just remember, it is all about that long game. Like, don't think too much about what you did wrong or what you should have done, because it is really the whole point of it is that it's supposed to take time. It's like part of the whole thing. It's like people do call it a 10-year town for a reason. Like it's really fundamentally true. It's I was just advice I always say, just try to be, don't try to rush anything. Like, don't try to force anything. The opportunities and stuff will come if you just kind of keep the right mindset. That's probably the advice I'd give myself, would be like, don't be so down on yourself. You know what I mean? Like, try to have maybe thicker skin, and just try to be a little more, I wouldn't say confident, but have faith. You know what I mean? Like, because I think at the time there was definitely times in my career and times in my life where there wasn't an end in sight. You know what I mean? Like, it was very much like, I think that sort of goes with a lot of people in their 20s experience that, whether they're coming out of school or like college or whatever career they're in. Is that there's often that crisis moment where they just, sometimes you have a panic and you don't know what you're doing, and you think, oh, what, did I waste the last 10 years of my life? Is this really what I want to do? And I think just it's important to kind of just try to power through those moments where sometimes it might be good to listen to that instinct that says, this isn't where I want to be in life, and this isn't what I want to do. But sometimes it's like, it will pass. You know what I mean? It's like and if it doesn't, then it's then you gotta look at other avenues. But everyone has moments and spells in their career where things aren't going the way they want them to be. But I think you wouldn't be able to enjoy the good side of it if you didn't go through those hardships.
Right. So it's just showing up, being clear about what your intention is, and then just be patient until it happens. And you've clearly done that, over and over and over again. It's been great to see your career evolve, since you moved to town, and congrats on all your success. Thank you for joining the podcast with us. We appreciate you being on the show,
man. Dude, this was great.